Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. Joining us is Jeff Bialos, a partner at the Evershed Sutherland law firm who specializes in national security and aerospace matters. He's a former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Industrial Affairs who's been writing about the Defense Production Act and how it should be used in this pandemic and beyond. Jeff, thanks very much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here with you, as always, Vago.
So talk to us a little bit. You and Josh Gottbaum, another former industrial base chief at the Pentagon. In fact, I think he was the first occupant of the office that then went to John Goodman, passed through Steve Grunman, and then got to you during the Clinton administration. Talk to us about the Defense Production Act. The president has invoked it, I think, if memory serves correctly, 3 times. The Pentagon has enacted a number of so-called Title III actions. Explain to the audience what the Defense Production Act is, just to clarify in the minds of many what it is, how it can be used, and what are the powers that it gives the government in an emergency.
Sure. Thanks, Vago. There's been a lot of confusion about this. The Defense Production Act grew out of World War II, where you needed to mobilize industry to, make fighter jets and all sorts of things. And it came into place in the early 50s. What happened was that they felt there needed to be some statutory authority. And what they did is set up a law with multiple pieces. One piece allows the government to issue what's called rated contracts to industry. These are contracts that would step ahead of any commercial contracts. So if I give a contract to a company to make a commercial plane and a military plane, the military one is rated, that comes first in order if there's scarcity of supplies or whatever.
Right.
A second authority is an allocation authority to allocate what's being produced. That's rarely been used, only a few times perhaps since Korea. I think they used it in the Syrian bombing situation where they had to allocate supplies. Title III of the DPA creates a situation where the government could provide funding for the development of facilities. So that's where you say, I need some more facilitization for product A, B, or C,
Right.
Whether it's for surge capacity or something else. And finally, there's a provision, Article 7, for voluntary agreements with industry, like the CRAFT agreement, where the airlines agree they will help the Pentagon in times of exigency. That's what the DPA is. What it's not is, it doesn't force a company to keep its plant open if it wants to keep it closed. And that's what we said in the article on meat. It doesn't force a company to stay in business if its business isn't economic. And it can't do wage and price controls. There were other authorities that allowed some of those things, and they were repealed many years ago. But what I want to emphasize about this, is that in a way, what we have today with this pandemic, it is totally the type of situation that we've never experienced. Most DPA use is one-off situations. Let's build a facility for rare earth metals here. Let's rate a particular contract there. Let's incentivize some particular capability where we're worried about it being in short supply. These are one-off situations, and there really is no modern experiential base for dealing with the potential use of it in a systemic way in an emergency.
How should the act, and I should have noted to the audience that your office at the Pentagon is the office that oversees the act from the department side. Obviously, the National Security Council has a capability, and some of the binders and industrial work you generate goes over there and can be invoked in all manner of emergencies by the White House. Have we used the act as much as we should have? And why is it that we didn't? Because time and again, Ellen Lord has been in a position to say, not speaking for her, but it's like, we're ready to go. We're waiting for the demand signal from the White House on what to do. So we're ready to execute. talk to us a little bit about how we should be using this act and why we maybe haven't used it to its full authority.
Well, let me start with the why, which is something of a head scratcher, but I think it derives from several things. One, I think, look, this administration has uh, uh, um, a certain attitude toward the government bureaucracy, and it views it as the swamp and a bit, a distrust of it. And then FEMA, on top of that, is an agency that, I would say it is not had its more fine moments in recent years, and so there's a particular distrust of FEMA. That's number one. Number two, the business community, frankly, weighed in against the use of the Defense Production Act. The chamber wrote a paper that said it would violate our WTO obligations, among other things, which I found inexplicable because in a time of national emergency, of course, the WTO specifically allows a national security waiver. Indeed, half our legislation on sanctions in China are under it. So I just saw no basis for that. But there was definitely a industry view that, we should let the industry do it, and that's it. And I think the combination of those things led them not to do it, and tried to do it through willing volunteers and whatnot. The problem here is that this is a pandemic. This is a situation like none other, and it's a situation that draws itself to a systematic solution, because there are certain products, there's certain medical supplies, now testing and production of vaccines that are critically needed things, and yet there's no systematically organized effort to do it. Now, what I think ought to have been done, and still should be done, because to step back, when you look at the pandemic, you had phase one, but they're talking about a return in 6 months, and there could be experiences over 18 months where we're going to need not only to rebuild our stockpile, but to have surge capability for the future, and to put in place a testing infrastructure for the future, and to put in place a production infrastructure for vaccines when they get ready to be produced. And so what you could do, what should be done, and what should have been done, in my view, is you create a separate office using not just the DPA, but all the tools of the government together holistically. And by that, I mean DPA tools, funding sources in the budget. You need people with rapid contracting experience from Pentagon offices, from FEMA. You need people with market knowledge of these product areas, whether they're ventilators or whatnot, to presumably come from CDC and HHS, and taking all those powers and putting together a group under some senior person who has that authority, because frankly, you don't want the White House issuing contracts. They should look sector by sector. First, you map out who's there in the sector, industry-wise. Secondly, you send them questionnaires very quickly for turnaround. Third of all, you negotiate with them. And you use these powers, the DPA's, in effect, a carrot and a stick set of powers, to negotiate resolution. Now it may be, for example, people say, well, why wouldn't the private sector do this? Well, why wouldn't the private sector just respond to the signals for more masks or more ventilators? Well, sometimes companies have different reasons and incentives for not producing all of product A in their plant, even though they might get more money from it in the short term. And so that's where the government could step in this kind of market failure situation, can limit hoarding, can limit having governments compete against each other and raise prices, and try to systemically do it. And so, okay, who can do ventilators? Let's see, should we surge capacity here and finance building of an extra line? And then only when you satisfy that you can't do it through the existing ventilator companies do you go to the next closest substitute. I mean, you don't take a bicycle company and use it to build missiles.
Right.
So I think I think a systematic approach to it potentially would be far more effective than relying on willing volunteers in the marketplace, given the urgent need to get this done now. And particularly with testing and vaccines in mind, I think it's critical.
Well, I think that people underestimate the extraordinary role that the Pentagon, and particularly the Department of the Army, play in medical emergencies and vaccine creations and scale production and all of that stuff, including the vast infrastructure that exists in the military medical system, right down to surplus chickens in order to be able to produce vaccines And certainly one of the reasons we had to go with a shutdown is we didn't have enough tests. If we'd had enough tests, we wouldn't have had to do the kind of full shutdown and the economic implications of that.
Look, in fairness to this administration, nobody has had the institutional experience to put together an effort to deal with this kind of a situation. I don't think our pandemic planning over not just this administration, but over the years, for example, built in much in terms of using the DPA, foresaw these kinds of shortages. By the way, on the use of Title III of the DPA, the White House just issued an executive order delegating authority to the CEO of the International Development Finance Corp, a U.S. development institution, uh, on Title III of the DPA. And it's really kind of perplexing why that makes sense to put a development entity, which has some, I guess, private sector business acumen, in charge of Title III DPA type decisions. It's hard to understand.
And where should that be?
Well, again, I think that should be in an office that would have been created for the pandemic as an ad hoc office of people with all the right capabilities brought together under one roof, under one leader to systematically address all of these issues. Give me a good stockpile, give me good surge capability, give me good testing and vaccine production infrastructure.
But I mean, isn't this sort of a much more intuitive prioritization that if you see a wave of this size and scale coming at you, that you want to jump the gun and start producing test kits, start producing PPE, personal protective equipment and the like, and ventilators, as opposed to sort of holding off on a lot of these decisions? I mean, the president was balking at greenlighting more ventilator productions because it would have cost $1 billion. That was right on the heels of $2.2 trillion in spending we authorized. I mean, it was a little bit hard for people to understand why you wouldn't just move ahead and say, "Hey guys, start building more of these," or even directing some people to do that. I mean, was it? I mean, what was it, as you've mentioned? I mean, it wasn't a legal constraint that was
No,
the impediment.
it's hard to understand other than what I said. It's some combination of ideology, business community opposition, the feeling you could do it through their private sector volunteers. They had a whole operation underway, but it was ad hoc. It was being done out of a White House economic office rather than with a disciplined set of people doing it in a disciplined way. And I think it could be more effective. And you really worry about testing, where they've delegated the whole thing to the states, and yet the states don't have DPA tools, money, or all the
Right.
things you need to create a national infrastructure for testing for this and for the future, so that you don't have to go through this again. It's truly a head scratcher.
And unfortunately, Jen Santos, who was in the job for the Deputy Undersecretary for Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy, appears to have been fired, according to some, or transferred to a job in the Navy. Obviously, she was the point person for DPA at the department, and I think folks are trying to better understand what happened there. Let me take you to the issue of industrial base challenges for the department in the wake of this. One of the key things has been to try to balance excess consolidation, right? Do you want to try to avoid as much concentration and preserve as much competition as possible in this monopsony market? At the same time, the department's had somewhat an aversion to increased vertical integration. And yet there are folks who look at what's happening on the commercial side of the business and are concerned about what the implications are going to be on the defense side of things, especially in the supplier base. Post pandemic, what do you see as the industrial base challenges the department is going to face? Because I know Ellen Lord, the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment, has been very focused and actually tried to open money taps, try to make, accelerate progress payments so that the primes can pay their suppliers more easily and keep folks in business. What do you
I,
see as being some of
yeah,
the big impacts that we have to prepare for?
yeah. I think at the top level, I think the industry's fared well in this crisis. I think they're essential suppliers, so they are still operating. Number one, unlike a lot of business. The sub-tier is really more problematic because, of course, a lot of the firms are dual use. They're defense and aerospace. And when you're defense and aerospace, and, aerospace is going in a difficult direction, with the airlines out of work and whatever, and all their customers out, those businesses are going to be really challenged. Now, first of all, those businesses do have the option of various CARES Act programs. And some of them potentially, there's a specific one for companies in the national security space that I think it's less for pure play defense firms than it is for dual use firms. And hopefully firms can draw on that. And secondly, if those companies are struggling, you're right. I mean, primes and others are going to have to step in, and hopefully we'll be able to offer firms some kind of a lifeline. You'd like not to see too much vertical integration any more than there has been. Maybe some bright people in private equity ought to consider putting together some sort of facility for firms in the aerospace supply chain. That could be kind of creative in how that money is repaid. Almost like some kind of performance-based repayment plan or something, almost like project finance or something, because,
Right.
Those businesses probably will come back, and it's just a matter of time. But it's a challenge right now in the sector, and you don't want to see too much vertical integration. Sometimes it can be very good, but in this context, it's not necessarily a good thing.
Let me take you to the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States and the administration's drive more broadly to limit or make it harder for Chinese investors in the U.S. market. Obviously, the big concern is how active Chinese investment has been in the U.S. high-tech sector. There being an understanding that those investors would get access to some very critical technologies. So the administration has crafted the trusted marketplace. I want to get your comment on that. But first, I want you to talk about the CFIUS process and the new FIRMA regulations to try to limit as much as possible, or to better govern, or to have better oversight over Chinese investment in the United States. Talk to us about what these new standards mean for foreign investment in the United States, particularly in the defense and aerospace sectors.
Sure. So just in the CFIUS reforms have to be put in context of the reset of U.S. national security policy, because that's what's driven it. And it's over two administrations that reset has occurred, with a focus on near-peer competitors, strategic competitors, namely China. In light of that, I think this administration has essentially made a policy shift that they would like to see U.S. decoupling or disengagement of the high-tech relationships with China in a number of areas. And you see that from infrastructure, where there are now a series of procurement and other rules on 5G participation by the Chinese, in bulk power transmission, where there was a new executive order put out last week that authorizes the Deputy Secretary of Energy to create limits on Chinese involvement in the power grid. And CFIUS export controls, broadening of the controls on critical and emerging technology, university relationships with China, informal guidance to U.S. companies to limit their ties with China in the high-tech area, supply chain issues. Foreign investment is one of these areas. And, like the others, what they've done is, and it preceded the new legislation, is they have been concerned over a series of risks, and the CFIUS process has become more robust for everybody through not just China, but driven by China, through the approach taken in practice and in the new law. And in practice, basically, they look at, is emerging technology that could be critical to inform military capability going to go to a potential adversary? In the case of China, they assume that anything you send to one of these technologies to a commercial firm will likely end up in the state sector, given the ties between the state and the private sector in China. Will a Chinese company get access to sensitive U.S. personal data that could be exploited to the detriment of U.S. security? And will a Chinese firm get ownership of, and will they be a good steward of a U.S. critical infrastructure like telecom or power, where they could potentially use them for surveillance in the telecom area, or frankly, through cyber attacks and the like, they could sabotage them and potentially use them, disable them in an exigency. And all those risks are driving CFIUS cases and the whole decoupling agenda. In CFIUS, we've also passed FIRMA, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act of 2018, which expanded the coverage of cases to minority investments in critical technology, critical infrastructure, and real estate near ports. It put in mandatory filing requirements for companies with critical technology. And again, this applies across the board. So, my worry in this is, there are two issues here. One is this decoupling a good and sensible idea? Should we consider mitigating the risks in some of these areas? It seems the administration is not desirous of mitigating a lot of these risks. And what's the collateral damage? And you do worry about, for example, the investment area, among others, by putting these controls across the board, are we denying ourselves access to these critical technologies being developed in Europe and elsewhere, who might not want to be encumbered by our rules, and denying us access to technology that might help to inform our own military capability?
So your concern is that it may not, that certainly from a FIRMA standpoint, but also a trusted marketplace standpoint, that they may not, right? Because on trusted marketplace, what the department is trying to do is to create clean sources of capital that are American, if at all possible, and certainly not Chinese, flowing to academic institutions and to startups and all of that. Your concern is that it's not going to achieve the aim of reducing. I mean, will it limit China's ability? Your concern is that it will not only limit China's ability, but then also be dissuasive to others investing in the U.S. high-tech sector. Or
there are 2 points. One is, is this effective China policy to decouple? And if others are going to stand in our shoes, including our allies in Western Europe, you have to wonder how effective this is going to be, right? If others are going to engage with the Chinese on these high-tech things if we withdraw. So are we really going to be denying China? Maybe we'll slow it a bit, or we're going to deny them the ability to develop these technologies. The second thing is there's collateral damage. What's the implication of this? And you worry that there will be, in the long term, 2 sets of technology evolution developments, one with the United States and some countries that choose not to engage with China, and others, and a whole other set of technological cooperation in the world where the United States is not a party. And you do worry about that. I think at the heart of this really is, if you look at the risks here that the U.S. is focused on, there's a risk of, cyber. Will the Chinese be able to, through owning something, use cyber against us? There's a risk of, will they be able to surveil? All right. And then there's a broader risk in 5G. Will their economic dominance create national security issues? That's a harder one, and that one is not just national security. It's some kind of national security and economic prowess. But on the first two, the issue is mitigation possible? Is there some negotiation with China that should take place here so as not to disentangle the world into 2 different sets of technology flows? This administration, I think, has come to the conclusion, no. I think it's a hard problem. I don't think there's an easy answer to this, but clearly we're on the path to significant, substantial high-tech decoupling or disengagement, and I have to wonder about the policy efficacy and the collateral damage.
So if you had been in your old job, what do you think the right approach should be to safeguard U.S. interests, restrict Chinese access, but still encourage investment? Because as an antitrust lawyer and an advisor to companies large and small, American and overseas, you have to navigate these issues on a daily basis.
Well, I think that, there are going to be some areas where mitigation is not acceptable in the foreign investment context. But, the question is, can we shape mitigations that are potentially effective in some of these situations and facilitate collaboration. I mean, China is a big place. There are a lot of the private sector in China is not government controlled, and it's not necessarily China Inc. I also think it's not the end of history on China. What I mean by that is, it's true we have a country that's now become more autocratic than before, but that's not necessarily the end of history. And we've seen that in Hong Kong and other places. And do we want to encourage elements of Chinese society that create countervailing forces? So I think you have to look at that. On trusted foundry, let me get to, trusted marketplace. You raised that issue. Let me just get to that. I don't see what problem that solution is trying to solve. Small U.S. firms with interesting ideas. First of all, there's grant funding from the Pentagon and from other U.S. departments, $1 million or $2 million. Second of all, there are VCs that offer numerous fundings of various fundings in various ways. Granted, you may not want Chinese investment in some of these sensitive areas, but there are lots of other foreign sources of capital. And my question on the trusted marketplace initiative is, why in the cases where they've used it so far is they've not allowed other foreign investors, non-Chinese, to participate. I guess I'm troubled by that, because there's no evidence that others in the world are using investment in any kind of a predatory way. I mean, why are we throwing investors from around the world outside of China under the bus, so to speak, where they haven't engaged in extensive patterns of predatory conduct?
Jeff, thanks very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here, Vago.
And thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DEFAERO Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. And check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight. Bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.